I used to think American Special Operations Forces had mastered the art of jungle warfare. We had Macy v. SOG running deep penetration missions into Laos and Cambodia. We had long-range
Eagle 1,
reconnaissance
SITREP,
patrols
over.
slipping through enemy
Enemy
territory
movement
with
suspected north
encrypted
of checkpoint.
radios and cutting-edge equipment. We had Navy SEALs conducting ambushes in the Mekong Delta. Our operators moved in small teams, carried suppressed weapons, and knew how to vanish when the situation demanded it. People called us the quiet professionals, and for the most part, we believed it. Until the Australians arrived, when the first Australian SAS patrols began operating in Puak Tui Province in 1966, American commanders viewed them with polite curiosity. Here were soldiers from a Commonwealth nation, allies certainly, but operating in ways that seemed almost archaic by modern military standards. They moved slower than anyone else. They carried minimal communications equipment. They seemed to reject many of the technological advantages that American forces had come to rely on. Some U.S. personnel quietly questioned whether these methods would prove effective in the unforgiving environment of Vietnam, where the enemy owned the jungle and mistakes meant death. The skepticism didn't last long. Within months of their arrival, stories began circulating through American forward operating bases about patrols that seemed to materialize out of thin air, about Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army units that walked into devastating ambushes without ever knowing the Australians were there, about reconnaissance missions that returned with intelligence so detailed it seemed impossible that human beings could have gotten that close without being detected. The North Vietnamese began calling them Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle, and slowly, reluctantly at first, American Special Operations personnel began to realize that they were watching a different kind of warfare entirely. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment that deployed to Vietnam was not a hastily assembled unit. The SASR had been formally established in 1964, though its roots stretched back to 1957 when it existed as First SAS Company. Modeled after the British SAS and sharing their motto of "Who Dares Wins," the regiment had already proven itself in combat during the Indonesian confrontation in Borneo from 1965 to 1966. There, in dense jungle terrain remarkably similar to Vietnam, Australian SAS troops had conducted reconnaissance patrols and cross-border operations into Indonesian territory, honing techniques that would later shock their American counterparts. But it was the Australian experience in the Malayan emergency that truly shaped their approach to jungle warfare. Between 1948 and 1960, Australian forces had fought alongside British troops against communist insurgents in the Malayan jungle. This campaign, unlike the conventional battles of World War II or Korea, demanded patience, stealth, and an intimate understanding of jungle terrain. Australian soldiers learned to move through dense vegetation without leaving traces, to read the subtle signs of enemy presence, and most importantly, to become part of the environment rather than visitors passing through it. When U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk admitted at an ANZUS meeting in Canberra in May 1962 that American armed forces knew little about jungle warfare, it was a frank acknowledgement of a significant capability gap. The Australians had spent more than a decade mastering what the Americans were only beginning to learn. The first Australian SAS unit to deploy to Vietnam was 3 Squadron, which arrived at Vung Tau via Saigon on June 16, 1966, before moving to their base at Nui Dat the following day. From the beginning, their operational methods diverged sharply from American practices. A standard Australian SAS patrol consisted of only 5 men: a lead scout, patrol leader, second in command, signaller, and medic. These teams were not thrown together for individual missions. They remained intact for their entire tour of duty, developing an almost telepathic understanding of each other's movements and intentions. This cohesion was not accidental, but the result of deliberate personnel management that prioritized compatibility and long-term teamwork over individual skill alone. The Australians established their headquarters on what became known as SAS Hill at Nui Dat, an area so heavily secured that no other Australian or Allied forces were permitted entry without specific authorization. This physical separation reflected an operational philosophy that valued compartmentalization and security over integration. While American Special Operations units often worked closely with conventional forces, sharing facilities and coordinating operations through multiple command channels, the Australian SAS maintained a degree of separation that allowed them to develop and refine techniques without outside interference or pressure to conform to American operational norms. Between 1966 and 1971, each of the 3 Australian Sabre squadrons completed 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. They operated throughout Phuoc Tuy Province, as well as in Bien Hoa, Long Can, and Binh Tui provinces, serving as the eyes and ears of the 1st Australian Task Force. Their missions varied from medium-range reconnaissance patrols and observation of enemy troop movements to long-range offensive operations and ambushes deep in enemy-dominated territory. But it was the manner in which they conducted these operations that set them apart and eventually earned them legendary status among both allies and enemies. The first thing that struck American observers about Australian SAS patrols was their glacial pace of movement. Where American LRRP teams might cover several kilometers in a day, pushing to reach an observation point or rally at an extraction site, the Australians moved so slowly that it sometimes took them 9 hours to traverse a single mile of terrain. This was not due to physical limitations or lack of urgency. It was a calculated tactical decision based on a fundamental understanding that in reconnaissance operations, remaining undetected mattered infinitely more than speed. Every step was deliberate. The lead scout would place his foot carefully, testing the ground before committing his weight, ensuring no twig would snap, no loose stone would shift, no depression in the earth would reveal his passage. The rest of the patrol would follow in his exact footsteps, a practice that minimized their trail and created the illusion that only a single person had passed through the area. They moved in complete silence, communicating through subtle hand signals and prearranged movements that required no spoken words. During peak enemy activity hours, typically between 1100 and 1500 hours, in what they called POC time, the Australians would cease movement entirely, concealing themselves in the vegetation and simply watching, observing enemy movements and gathering intelligence without ever betraying their presence. This approach to movement was fundamentally different from American doctrine. U.S. Special Operations Forces in Vietnam were trained to move with purpose and speed, to control terrain through superior firepower and mobility, to break contact when compromised, and call in air support or artillery to cover their withdrawal. The implicit assumption was that technology and firepower could compensate for tactical exposure. If things went wrong, if a patrol was spotted or ambushed, American teams relied on their radios to summon extraction helicopters or gunships, on their superior weapons to fight their way out. on their training to execute immediate action drills that would create space and confusion. The Australians rejected this entire framework. Their doctrine was built on a simple but profound principle. If you are detected, you have already failed. Every aspect of their training and equipment was designed around the goal of complete invisibility. They didn't plan for contingencies if they were discovered, because their entire operational approach was predicated on never being discovered in the first place. This wasn't bravado or recklessness. It was a cold, calculated assessment that in deep enemy territory, survival depended on remaining a ghost, not on fighting your way out of a bad situation. This philosophy extended to their choice of equipment and how they carried it. While American Special Operations personnel loaded themselves with radios, spare batteries, claymore mines, extra ammunition, signal mirrors, and various pieces of technology designed to provide options in different tactical scenarios, the Australians stripped their kit to absolute essentials. They carried minimal visible communications equipment. When asked about this apparent vulnerability, Australian signalers would simply pat their chest pouches containing message cards and state matter-of-factly that if they didn't return, someone would eventually find the card and know what had happened. If they did return, they clearly hadn't needed to call for help. This wasn't fatalism, it was preparation. The Australians didn't plan to be rescued because they planned to not need rescue. Every patrol was exhaustively rehearsed before insertion. Team members would walk through their mission over and over, discussing every possible contingency, every decision point, every action and reaction until the patrol could execute their mission with minimal communication. They memorized terrain features, studied aerial photographs, until they could navigate by landmarks rather than constant map checks, and developed a shared understanding of how they would respond to different situations without needing to discuss it in the field. The result was a unit that moved through the jungle like a single organism. When one man stopped, they all stopped instantly. No staggered halts, no domino effect of soldiers catching up to the person ahead. When the patrol leader adjusted course, shifting direction by just a few degrees based on a tree, a rock formation, or the slope of the land, the rest of the patrol followed without question or confirmation. They were tethered by invisible threads of mutual understanding, each man perfectly aware of where the others were and what they were doing, without needing to look back or speak. This level of coordination was alien to most American units, which relied heavily on verbal communication and technological systems to maintain tactical cohesion. When U.S. long-range reconnaissance patrol personnel from the 101st Airborne Division began patrolling with Australian SAS units in September 1967, they were stunned by what they witnessed. Here were men operating in some of the most dangerous territory in Southeast Asia, completely surrounded by enemy forces, and they did it without saying a word for days at a time. Navy SEAL Roger Hayden, a Vietnam veteran who attended Army Ranger School and multiple other specialized training courses, later said that he learned more about reconnaissance in 10 days with the Australians than anywhere else in the world. Coming from the underwater demolition teams, Hayden freely admitted that SEALs at that time lacked the fieldcraft necessary for extended jungle operations. They lost men, he acknowledged, because they simply weren't prepared for the demands of moving silently through enemy territory for extended periods. The Australians' fieldcraft was so refined, so thoroughly practiced, that it forced American special operators to reconsider fundamental assumptions about how reconnaissance should be conducted. The Australians' approach to observation positions was equally revelatory. Where American teams might set up an observation post at a safe distance from a trail or enemy position, using binoculars and scopes to watch from cover, Australian SAS patrols would crawl to within meters of enemy positions. They would burrow under rotted logs, cover themselves with mud and wet leaves, and lie absolutely motionless for hours, sometimes days, watching enemy movements with their naked eyes. The level of discipline required for this was extraordinary. A sneeze, a cough, even rapid breathing could give away their position and result in immediate death. During one mission, observing a suspected North Vietnamese Army supply route, an Australian patrol positioned itself so close to the trail that when NVA runners passed carrying supplies, the SAS soldiers could read the markings on rice sacks and note details on the soldiers' equipment and uniforms. They didn't raise their weapons. They didn't shift their positions for a better view. They simply watched, memorized everything they saw, and after the enemy had passed, they vanished as silently as they had arrived. When they returned to base and provided their intelligence report, American officers were astounded by the detail. They had descriptions of individual enemy soldiers, estimates of cargo weight based on how the men moved under load, observations about the condition of equipment, and uniforms that indicated unit types and morale levels. This intelligence was invaluable. It allowed Allied commanders to build detailed pictures of enemy logistics, to track unit movements, to identify patterns and vulnerabilities that could be exploited, and the Australians gathered it without ever firing a shot, without ever revealing their presence, without ever giving the enemy any indication that they were being watched. This was reconnaissance elevated to an art form. The Australian approach to exfiltration was equally meticulous. Where American teams might withdraw along the most direct route back to friendly territory, brushing aside vegetation and leaving tracks that were covered only minimally, the Australians treated their withdrawal as carefully as their insertion. They walked on roots and rocks wherever possible to avoid leaving footprints. They crawled through creek beds where water would erase their passage. Every resting place was cleaned of any sign that humans had been there. Even their spit was buried. When American personnel later tried to locate where Australian patrols had set up their observation posts, they often couldn't find any trace. It was eerie, unsettling, and profoundly educational. This commitment to leaving no trace wasn't just about immediate tactical security. The Australians understood that every mark they left in the jungle was a piece of intelligence for the enemy. A disturbed patch of vegetation, a footprint in mud, a broken branch could tell a skilled tracker that foreign troops were operating in the area. And once the enemy knew that reconnaissance teams were present, they would change their behavior, alter their routes, increase their security, making future intelligence gathering exponentially more difficult. By maintaining absolute invisibility, the Australians ensured that enemy forces continued to use their normal patterns and procedures, making them predictable and vulnerable. The Australian SAS also demonstrated remarkable fire discipline. Their patrols were heavily armed despite their small size, carrying weapons like the L1A1 self-loading rifle, M16S, CAR-15S, M79 grenade launchers, silenced Sterling submachine guns, mysteriously acquired from the United Kingdom, general-purpose machine guns, combat shotguns, claymore mines, and various pistols. This arsenal was not for sustained firefights. It was designed to create the illusion of a much larger force if contact became unavoidable. Australian contact drills, similar to those used by American SOG recon teams, called for sudden and overwhelming firepower to cover withdrawal, giving the small patrol precious seconds to break contact and escape. But the Australians rarely needed to execute these drills. Between 1966 and 1971, Australian and New Zealand SAS forces conducted nearly 1,200 combat patrols in Vietnam. During this period, they killed 492 enemy soldiers, with another 106 possibly killed, 47 wounded, and 11 captured. These were remarkable numbers for such a small force, but the truly extraordinary statistic was their own casualties. 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness, with 28 wounded. This was the highest kill ratio of any unit in the entire Vietnam War. The Australians were not just surviving in the jungle. They were dominating it while remaining virtually invisible. This operational success was not lost on American commanders. In September 1966, just months after the first Australian SAS squadron deployed to Vietnam, personnel from the Australian SASR began providing instruction at the MACV Recondo School at NHA Trang. The Recondo School, formally established on July 1, 1966, under the command of Major A.J. Baker, was designed to train long-range reconnaissance personnel from all Free World military assistance forces in Vietnam. The school had been created in response to urgent demand from conventional units that needed reconnaissance capabilities beyond their organic cavalry troops and infantry battalion recon platoons. The 3-week Recondo course consisted of 260 hours of classroom and field instruction covering patrolling techniques, first aid, land navigation, radio procedures, weapons familiarity, and culminating in an actual combat patrol to demonstrate students' skills. The course had a 50% failure rate, and those who graduated were expected to share their knowledge with their respective units, ensuring that every LRRP team in Vietnam spoke a common language of long-range patrolling. Australian SAS instructors brought to this school hard-won lessons from Malaya, Borneo, and their ongoing operations in Vietnam. They taught American students the importance of slow, deliberate movement. They demonstrated techniques for reading jungle terrain, for identifying enemy sign, for moving through vegetation without leaving traces. They emphasized the critical importance of pre-mission rehearsal, of developing team cohesion that didn't require constant verbal communication, of planning operations around the assumption that you would not be extracted if things went wrong. For many American students, this was a profound shift in thinking. They had been trained to rely on their equipment, their firepower, their ability to call in support when needed. The Australians were teaching them to rely on nothing except their skills, their teammates, and their ability to become invisible. It was uncomfortable, even frightening, to contemplate operating without the technological safety nets that American military culture emphasized. But the results spoke for themselves. Australian SAS patrols were achieving mission success rates and casualty ratios that American units could only dream of. The instruction didn't flow in only one direction. Australian SAS personnel also served alongside American Special Forces on MACV ESOG missions, those highly classified cross-border operations into Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. Some Australian operators served on exchange with American units, bringing their techniques while also learning from their American counterparts' expertise in areas like high-altitude parachuting, scuba operations, and the use of various specialized equipment. This exchange created a mutual respect between Australian and American Special Operations Forces that persists to this day. But it also created a certain amount of healthy humility among American personnel, who had previously considered themselves the pinnacle of special operations capability. Watching the Australians work forced them to confront uncomfortable questions about whether they had become too dependent on technology, too loud in their movements, too willing to rely on firepower rather than stealth. Some American units began adopting Australian techniques. Long-range reconnaissance patrol teams started moving more slowly, spending more time in pre-mission rehearsals, focusing more intensively on noise discipline and leaving no trace. Some Saudi recon teams modified their operations to incorporate elements of the Australian approach, particularly regarding movement techniques and camouflage discipline. The influence was gradual and uneven, constrained by institutional inertia and the reality that changing operational doctrine in the middle of a war is extraordinarily difficult. But the seed had been planted. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong certainly noticed the Australians. Their name for the Australian SAS, Ma Rung or Phantoms of the Jungle, reflected genuine fear and respect. In several communist military histories, even regular Australian infantry battalion elements were referred to as Biet Keech, which means commandos, a designation normally reserved for elite special forces. The North Vietnamese noted that Australian units routinely operated in section and half-platoon-sized patrols, much smaller than the company or battalion-sized American operations, and considered all Australian troops to be elite forces as compared to U.S. forces that appeared to operate in larger, more conventional formations. The Battle of Long Tan in August 1966 demonstrated that Australian tactical prowess extended beyond special operations. When D Company, 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, was surrounded by an estimated 2,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops, the 108 Australians fought a desperate 4-hour battle that resulted in 245 enemy dead left on the battlefield, while the Australians suffered 18 killed in action. The North Vietnamese were so badly mauled that their East Zone Command subsequently issued orders forbidding its units from ambushing Australian units without permission from higher headquarters. This was an extraordinary admission that engaging Australians was considered exceptionally dangerous and should only be done when absolutely necessary or when significant numerical superiority could be guaranteed. After the battles for Firebase Coral Balmoral in 1968, where Australian and New Zealand forces repeatedly repulsed North Vietnamese attacks despite being heavily outnumbered, the NVA largely avoided Nui Dat Province for as long as Australian forces were defending it. The psychological impact of consistently losing engagements to smaller Australian forces fundamentally changed how the North Vietnamese approached operations in Phuoc Tuy Province. They learned, painfully, that Australian patrols moved differently, fought differently, and were nearly impossible to surprise or ambush despite operating in small numbers deep in enemy territory. An Australian Army captain, when asked about the difference between Australian and American approaches, noted succinctly that Americans trained for 5 or 6 different types of warfare, while Australians trained only for jungle warfare. This specialization, combined with the experience gained in Malaya and refined in Borneo, gave Australian forces an edge that was difficult for other nations to replicate. The Jungle Warfare Training Centre at Canungra, Queensland, produced soldiers who were not just comfortable in dense jungle, but who could use it as both weapon and shield. By the time the last Australian SAS squadron withdrew from Vietnam in 1971, their legacy was firmly established. They had conducted nearly 1,200 patrols with minimal casualties while inflicting heavy losses on the enemy. They had trained American personnel in reconnaissance techniques that would influence special operations doctrine for decades to come. They had demonstrated that in certain operational environments, stealth and patience could be more effective than firepower and technology. And they had earned a reputation as phantoms of the jungle that persisted long after the last Australian soldier left Vietnamese soil. For American Special Operations personnel who worked alongside the Australians, the experience was humbling and educational in equal measure. These were men who had been selected through rigorous screening, trained to standards they believed were the highest in the world, and who operated in an environment where mistakes meant death. Discovering that another nation's forces were operating at a higher level in certain critical skills forced a reckoning with assumptions about American military superiority that many had taken for granted. The lesson wasn't that American forces were inadequate or poorly trained. American Special Operations units achieved remarkable successes throughout the Vietnam War, conducting thousands of dangerous missions and gathering critical intelligence. But the Australians demonstrated that there were different ways to approach the same problems, that technologies and tactics that worked well in some contexts might not be optimal in others, and that sometimes the old ways, refined through decades of experience, could outperform newer approaches. This lesson extended beyond Vietnam. In subsequent conflicts, American Special Operations Forces incorporated many elements of the Australian approach. The emphasis on slow, deliberate movement in hostile territory, the focus on leaving no trace, the investment in extensive pre-mission rehearsals to build team cohesion, the willingness to operate without constant communication or immediate access to extraction. These became standard elements of American Special Operations doctrine, particularly for units conducting reconnaissance in denied areas where detection meant mission failure or death. The bond between Australian and American Special Operations Forces, forged in the jungles of Vietnam, remained strong long after the war ended. When Australia committed forces to operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, Australian SAS troops worked seamlessly alongside American Special Operations units, sharing techniques and lessons learned from decades of operations in complex environments. The mutual respect that began with American soldiers watching Australian phantoms disappear into the Vietnamese jungle had evolved into a partnership between two of the world's most capable special operations communities. For the men who served in the Australian SAS during Vietnam, their methods were simply how things were done. They didn't seek recognition or publicity. Their operations remained classified for years after the war ended. They were content to do their jobs, to serve their country, to protect their teammates, and to return home when their tours were complete. But their impact on how modern special operations are conducted cannot be overstated. In the years and decades following the Vietnam War, military historians and special operations professionals have studied the Australian SAS experience, trying to understand what made them so effective. The answers are complex and multifaceted. Part of it was the experience gained in Malaya and Borneo. Part of it was the deliberate emphasis on jungle warfare training to the exclusion of other mission sets. Part of it was the personnel selection process that prioritized not just individual skill, but also the ability to work cohesively in small teams over extended periods. Part of it was a culture that valued patience, discipline, and invisibility over aggressive action and high body counts. But perhaps the most important factor was a fundamental philosophy about what reconnaissance missions were meant to accomplish. The Australians understood that the goal was not to kill enemies or to demonstrate combat prowess. The goal was to gather intelligence while remaining undetected. Everything else, every tactical decision, every piece of equipment, every training exercise was subordinated to that singular objective. And because they maintained that focus with absolute discipline, they achieved results that seemed almost impossible to units operating under different doctrines. The story of the Australian SAS in Vietnam is one of professionalism, discipline, and tactical excellence. It's a story of men who moved through the jungle so silently that even experienced American Special Operations personnel couldn't track them. It's a story of patrols that positioned themselves so close to enemy forces that they could count the buttons on uniforms while remaining completely invisible. It's a story of a unit that achieved the highest kill ratio of the Vietnam War while suffering minimal casualties. And it's a story that fundamentally changed how American and other Allied forces approached reconnaissance operations in hostile environments. They were mocked initially for their slow movement and minimal equipment. They were questioned for their refusal to rely on technology and their apparent disregard for the safety nets that other units considered essential. But when American units started disappearing at night, when patrols vanished into the jungle and returned with intelligence that seemed impossible to gather, when the enemy began avoiding entire provinces because the phantoms were there, the mockery stopped, and in its place came respect, admiration, and a desire to learn from these quiet professionals who had mastered the art of becoming invisible. The Australian SAS didn't just fight in Vietnam. They taught everyone who watched them that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't firepower or technology. Sometimes it's the ability to move through the darkness, to watch without being seen, to understand without being detected, and to strike only when necessary before disappearing like smoke in the jungle canopy. They were ghosts, phantoms, ma rung, and they remain, decades later, a standard against which all reconnaissance forces measure themselves. In the end, the greatest tribute to the Australian SAS isn't found in official histories or combat statistics, though those are impressive enough. It's found in the American Special Operations personnel who trained with them, learned from them, and carried those lessons forward into subsequent conflicts. It's found in the reconnaissance techniques that are still taught at special operations schools around the world. It's found in the understanding, hard-won and paid for in the jungles of Vietnam, that mastery of a craft requires patience, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to excellence even when no one is watching. The Australian SAS showed us what it meant to be true phantoms of the jungle, and the lesson they taught, written in silence and shadow across the battlefields of Vietnam, remains as relevant today as it was more than 50 years ago.